In this video, I'll be providing you with 10 tips and tricks for Tarkir Dragonstorm draft so you can be more successful in your events. First up, prioritize mana fixing. This is a key aspect of the format because there are so many colorful and powerful cards to deploy. First up are the tri-lands. These are lands that enter the battlefield tapped and tap for one of 3 different colors. When you are in these 3 color wedges, these cards should be high priority picks. You should take them as if they were high quality removal spells or things like that because they make it so much easier to deploy your cards on curve. Next are the gain lands. These cards enter the battlefield tapped and gain you a life, hence the term gain land, and then they tap for one of 2 different colors. These cards are also a priority for you, but you should still be taking cards like premium removal, premium commons, really good value cards over them, but you should take these over the filler cards that you're going to be putting in your deck. So if you have a choice between a gain land that's in your colors and a card that's going to make your deck but not going to be exciting, just snap up the gain land to make it easier to deploy your cards on curve. Next is the common mana fixing, of which Evolving Wilds, Dragonstorm, Globe, and Sagu Wildling are the best. Evolving Wilds is great because it's mana fixing that can fit into any color. Dragonstorm Globe similarly fits into any color, though you will want to mostly put this into your late game decks. There is where it shines though, because buffing up your dragons is a real upside there. And then Sagu Wildling, when you're in green, is nice fixing because of that Roost Seek mode to be able to just get a basic land from your deck, and then be a nice 5 mana play against those aggro decks that you will face. Embermouth Sentinel and Roamer's Routine are definitely cards you can put in your deck, but they are much lower priority, and oftentimes even if you have them in your pool, and if you have good enough fixing, you won't even include them in your decks. Next is the Devotee Cycle. These are cards that you'll put into your deck to supplement your mana fixing that's in your mana base, and they are cards that are going to be solid in those home guilds. Sometimes they'll just be solid playables outside of that, such as just putting a Jeskai Devotee into your aggressive red-white deck, even if you don't care about the blue mana fixing, or Sultai Devotee into your teamer deck, even if you don't care about the black mana fixing, things like that. Of these, Mardu Devotee is definitely the highest priority because mana fixing in the Mardu deck is absolutely premium, and being able to have that attached to a 1-drop that helps you curve out thanks to its scrying ability is really nice to have. So Mardu Devotee, the highest priority Devotee, but putting these in your deck is going to supplement your mana fixing and help you cast your spells, which is critical in this format. Next tip, stick to your bombs. In some formats, it's advantageous to be flexible and be willing to move off of your bombs, but in Tarkir Dragonstorm, cards like Teval, Arbiter of Virtue, Jeskai Revelation, Roar of Endless Song are cards that if you take them early, you should almost always be including in your deck because, as we just discussed, there is such abundant mana fixing. So in a normal set, you take a Jeskai Revelation early, the Jeskai colors aren't open, you're willing to move away from that to draft what's open. In this set, a lot of the time, even if Jeskai isn't open, you can just build a green deck that has a little bit of touch into the 2 colors that you're missing. So maybe you're playing a Sultai deck, and then you just include a little bit of fixing for red, a little bit of fixing for white, and jam that Jeskai Revelation into your deck, and it's going to be so powerful that it makes up for the fact that it's hard to cast. And because the mana fixing is available, instead of moving away from your bombs and taking cards that are going to go into a different deck, it's better to just stick to your bomb and just work your deck in such a way that you'll be able to put the bomb into your deck. So take that mana fixing highly to be able to include those bomb rares, and they will pay you off because they are so powerful. Next, aggro decks splash less. So in this format with all these colors and things like that, it's oftentimes tempting to just always try to splash the cards that you see or take them and then aggressively take the mana fixing as we just talked about. But if you're playing an aggressive deck, you should be splashing less. So in a red-white deck, you'll probably want to splash Inevitable Defeat because it's such a great spell, because the black splash is worth it for a card that's going to exile any non-land permanent and then drain your opponent for 3. That's really powerful. But a card like Bone Cairn Butcher, which is much less powerful than Inevitable Defeat, is a card that you'll sometimes play it if you have the fixing, but it's not going to be a priority to splash because it's so much more punishing to not be able to play your cards on curve. And the fact that you could play a 4-drop that's in your main colors, like for example, you're playing a red-white deck, you can just put in a red or white 4-drop and that you'll always be able to play, that's going to be better a lot of the time than a Bone Cairn Butcher that you won't always be able to deploy on curve, because the downside of missing out on your curve out is much higher in an aggressive deck. So just keep that in mind, that if you are an aggressive deck, you still want to prioritize fixing, you still want to try to splash the most powerful cards you see, but the less powerful cards aren't always worth the splash. Next, counterspells are played often in this format. That's something that's not always the case in limited Magic the Gathering, but cards like Dispelling Exhale are premium commons in the set. Dispelling Exhale in particular, a really good common. So if you have the ability to play your lands first to play around that counter unless you pay 2, that's something that's worth doing. And knowing that your opponent could have these counter spells means that if you have a really premium card, you should sometimes try to bait out the counter spell. Play a card you care about a little bit less to see if they maybe don't have the counter spell and will use it on the threat you care about less. So Dispelling Exhale is a counter spell unless they pay 2. If you have a dragon, it's a counter if they pay 4. Riverwalk technique can counter non-creature spells or be used as a removal spell of sorts to put the card back into the opponent's deck. And then Spectral Denial is another counter spell that counters unless they pay a certain amount of mana. And so these sorts of things are things to be aware of, because if you have a really premium card that you want to resolve, it's definitely worth keeping these in mind, because sometimes your opponent will just have the counter spell to stop it before it even comes into play. Next, maximize your mobilize. That's a really fun way of saying that there is the mobilize mechanic in this set on cards like Dalkovan Packbeast, which says mobilize 3. When this creature attacks, create 3 tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature tokens. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Mobilize cards are really powerful if you put in some work to make those mobilize tokens worthwhile. So one of the ways you can do that is by buffing those mobilize tokens. So a card like Bearer of Glory, which can give all your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. If you're attacking, even if with only temporary tokens, giving them all +1/+1 is going to be great. War Effort similarly gives all your creatures +1/+0 and even helps you get those extra 1/1s when you attack. And so buffing all those creatures is really, really nice. Also, taking advantage of going wide with these mobilize tokens is a card like Coordinated Maneuver, which if you attack, mobilize, before your opponent goes to blocks, you can use Coordinated Maneuver to deal damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker. So you get a really nice 2-mana efficient removal spell if you're able to go wide with mobilize. So these mass pump spells, cards like Coordinated Maneuver that take advantage of going wide, are one of the best ways to maximize your mobilize. Another way you can maximize your mobilize, I just love that phrase, is with cards that care about the tokens coming into play, like Shocking Sharpshooter, which is whenever another creature you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to target opponent. So the Shocking Sharpshooter is going to be able to ping your opponent whenever those mobilized tokens enters. A card like Venerated Stormsinger is similar, except it cares about those creatures dying. So when Venerated Stormsinger and this creature or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So when those mobilized tokens die, you're going to be draining your opponent for 1 life, which is another really nice thing to be able to do. And then a card like Unsparing Boltcaster also pays you off for these mobilized tokens by being able to let you attack. And when your opponent just blocks those tokens because it's almost a free block, they don't want to take the damage, your Unsparing Boltcaster can deal 5 damage to a creature that was dealt damage this turn. So keeping in mind that these cards will really help facilitate your mobilized decks and make those cards with mobilize much more powerful is a key aspect of the format. Next, card draw is good again. There have been some formats where just pure card draw spells aren't particularly great. You need to be affecting the board state. If you play a card draw spell, you'll fall behind. This is not one of those formats because the card draw spells are good. Things like Unending Whisper as a draw a card and then harmonize later to draw another card is definitely a solid card in the format. Focus the Mind, which looks like it costs 5 mana, but oftentimes you're casting for 3 to just draw 3 cards, discard a card. Pure raw card advantage, digging you through your deck, digging you towards your bombs, things like that. And then a card like Rakshas's Bargain. Look at the top 4, put 2 in your hand, the rest into your graveyard. These cards are definitely ones that you can play, sometimes even multiple copies of, in your late game control decks as a way to pull ahead in the control mirrors and to really take over the game if you are playing against an aggressive deck once you have stabilized. So these cards are not just things you should dismiss out of hand just because they're card draw spells that don't affect the board state. Definitely give these a second look and try to include them in your decks when you are able to. Next, dragons get a synergy boost. So there is a cycle of cards called Dragonstorms that care about you having dragons that enter the play. And so all dragons get better just because these cards are in the set, because if you see one of these, you want to have some dragons already to be able to trigger them. So Teeming Dragonstorm and Roiling Dragonstorm are the best of this bunch. Teeming Dragonstorm makes you a couple of tokens, and then when a dragon you control enters, you return to your hand. Roiling Dragonstorm draws you 2, then discards 1. Corroding Dragonstorm is one I would advise against playing unless you have a highly specific deck for it. So that is the one that I would advise against. Breaching Dragonstorm, occasionally playable. If you have enough expensive dragons, Encroaching Dragonstorm can be playable as well. But the main 2 you're interested in with the Dragonstorms is the white and the blue one. There's also a cycle of Exhales, which are premium removal spells in their colors. The blue, black, red, and green ones are all some of the best commons in their colors. The white one is totally solid. You can definitely put it in your deck. You're not going to regret playing it, but it's not as premium as the others. But these cards also pay you off for having dragons that you are able to behold when you play them. So if you have one in play or in hand, and these also make dragons get a little bit better. And so the common dragons, therefore, are going to be a little bit better than they might look on the surface just because they enable these other commons and uncommons to really flourish. So the particular ones of interest are the blue, red, and green ones, because those are the colors that are often building into these late game dragon decks that are splashing colors and things like that. But the white one and the black one are totally playable as well if you're still trying to enable these dragon synergy pieces. But just keep that in mind, even if you don't have any of the dragon synergy cards yet, you're likely to see one or two of them during the draft, and so taking the dragons a little bit higher than you maybe were thinking of them based on their pure power level is going to be worth it, because if you play the dragon, it might not just be the dragon. It might be dragon plus pick up your Dragonstorm, or you get to behold it early in the game just by having it in your hand, things like that. Next, the graveyard is important in this set, and that's not always the case with every set, but it's definitely true in Tarkir Dragonstorm. There is the renew mechanic, which you see on a card like Champion of Doosan, which is an ability to exile the card from your graveyard to get some benefit. So with Champion of Doosan, you exile it, put a +1/+1 counter and a trample counter onto your creature. So having cards that are going to be able to fill your graveyard is beneficial because of a card like Champion of Doosan. There's also the harmonize mechanic, so a card like Glacial Dragon Hunt, if this happens to end up in your graveyard somehow, you can harmonize it. So you can cast it from your graveyard for its harmonize cost by tapping a creature you control to reduce that cost by X, where X is its power, then you exile the spell. So this is another benefit to filling your graveyard. So a card like Einok Wayfarer, which a lot of players are often afraid to mill cards because they don't want to mill their really good cards. A card like Einok Wayfarer is really good in this type of set, because when you mill 3 cards, you not only are going to probably be able to grab a land and get that card advantage by having a 1/1 plus a land, but also if you mill over any of your renew cards, any of your harmonized cards, then you're going to be really happy that you did, because that's just an extra resource for you to use. So a card like Einok Wayfarer is not something to be afraid of, it's something to rejoice and be happy that you have. And similarly, a card like Veteran Ice Climber, when it attacks, up to one target player mills cards equal to this creature's power, you should usually be targeting yourself, because you're going to have cards in your deck that are going to pay you off for filling your graveyard. You're going to have these renew cards, these harmonized cards. There's also just some other graveyard synergy pieces, and so filling your own graveyard is beneficial, and milling your opponent is likely to be a mistake, because your opponent could easily have some of these cards we've just been talking about. They could have renew cards, they could have harmonized cards, and if you use your Veteran Ice Climber to mill your opponent and they flip over one of those cards, you've given them an extra resource for no reason. So just keep that in mind. Filling your own graveyard is beneficial in this set, and it's not something to be afraid of. Finally, not finally, so almost finally, but combat tricks to play around. There are quite a few combat tricks in the set, but after getting some experience with the set, these are the ones that at common you should be aware of and should be first to your mind when your opponent makes a suspicious attack. First up is Snakeskin Veil. 1 mana, put a counter on a creature, and it gains hexproof. So if you have a card that you're really trying to get rid of and your opponent's been holding up a green mana, Snakeskin Veil should come to mind, because that hexproof can really foil your plans to kill their threats. And similarly, if you have Snakeskin Veil, it's oftentimes worth waiting an extra turn to play your really key cards so you can hold up Snakeskin Veil to protect them. Sarkhan's Resolve, also a really good combat trick in this set. The +3/+3 is almost a backup mode on the 2 mana destroy target creature with flying mode, because there are dragons in this set to kill. Rebellious Strike, 1 and a white. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn, and you draw a card. So this is really good with those mobilized cards that we talked about, where if your opponent blocks one of your 1/1 tokens, then you can use this to give +3/+0 to the token, destroy their blocker a lot of the time, and then your 1/1 was going to die anyway, so you don't really care. Or you can just use this to push damage or any number of things, a very flexible combat trick. Finally, this is the final tip. Tap your mana carefully. This is a set that has a lot of complex mana requirements. We've already talked about how much fixing is in the set. There's a lot of optionality with your lands. They can tap for multiple colors, and tapping your mana carefully is absolutely key, because you can totally lose games that you would have won otherwise simply by tapping out your mana improperly and not being able to cast all of the spells that you planned on casting in your turn. Some ways to make sure that you tap your mana properly. First, plan your turn in advance. Know, okay, I'm going to play this card and this card. And once you've planned your turn in advance and you're happy with it, just enact your game plan. Sure, if your opponent responds, you can maybe try to change your plan, but you should ideally plan for your opponent's response within your plan. Like, oh, I'm going to do this, and if my opponent does this, then I'll do Y, Z, or whatever I'm going to do. And by planning your turn in advance, you're going to make sure that you never end up in a situation where you're looking at the cards in your hand and realizing that you don't have the mana to cast your key removal spell or something like that. Number 2, remember what you are trying to represent. So even if you don't have a card in your hand at the moment, if you are trying to pretend that you have a counterspell that we've discussed, one of those counterspells that we already looked at, or you're trying to pretend that you have one of the combat tricks that we already looked at, you want to make sure that you're consistent with your storytelling, and that when you pass your turn, you're holding up at least 1 blue mana to represent that counterspell or things like that. And so remembering what you are trying to represent is key as well as part of this tapping your mana correctly. And then 3, play without hesitation. Once you've decided on your turn, you don't want to give your opponent any tells by being like, okay, I'll tap this. Wait, never mind, I'll tap this, because then you're being obvious about which mana you're leaving up, and your opponent can maybe deduce which cards are in hand. They're like, oh, they're being very conscientious to leave up black mana on their turn. They probably have this black removal spell or something like that. And sure, there's like the mind games of trying to fool your opponent, but nobody's really that good at acting in general. Just try to make sure that you play without hesitation, give away nothing, and your opponent's not going to be able to get a read on you, and that's going to be more beneficial in the long run. So play on your turn in advance, remember what you're trying to represent, and also play without hesitation, and that's going to really help you make the most of your mana and tap things correctly. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more videos, comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback, and leave hashtag Tarkir time in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Good luck in your drafts, and I'll talk to you next time.